It's one of the Old Testament's most compelling tales. The mystical prophet Moses taking on the mighty Pharaoh of Egypt. 10 sinister plagues rain down on ancient Egypt, destroying everything in sight. But is there any truth behind this alluring legend? Now scientists and archaeologists are re-examining these extraordinary stories, shedding new light on the seemingly supernatural, and revealing sensational evidence suggesting that the biblical plagues of Egypt may be based on real events that shook the ancient world thousands of years ago.
This is what the Lord says. By this you will know that I am the Lord. With the staff that is in my hand, I will strike the water of the Nile, and it will be changed into blood. The fish in the Nile will die, and the river will stink. The Egyptians will not be able to drink its water. Exodus chapter 7, verses 17 and 18.
The first biblical plague struck the Egyptians at their most vulnerable point. The river of life became a tide of death. German experts in water quality and freshwater marine biology at the acclaimed Leibniz Institute have identified what they believe is a likely cause of the biblical blood plague: an infestation of poisonous blue-green algae. Biologist Stefan Flugmacher is studying a bacterium known as burgundy blood algae. He thinks it may be the key to unraveling the story of the biblical plagues. This unique bacterium thrives in fresh water and is highly toxic. Scientists know it existed 3,000 years ago. And most importantly, it's red. According to the Bible story, the Nile turned red in just one day. But in a lab, red algae takes 2 to 3 weeks to flourish. But it can destroy a freshwater habitat very quickly by causing oxygen levels to plummet. Fish die, and freshwater becomes undrinkable, just as the Bible story describes. A burgundy blood algae outbreak seems like one viable explanation for the first plague. But what of the other terrifying plagues apparently unleashed upon the land and people of a stubborn pharaoh?
This is what the great Lord says. Let my people go, so that they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go, I will plague your whole country with frogs. The Nile will teem with frogs. Exodus chapter 7, verses 1 through 3.
The Bible describes a frightening scene as frogs descend on Pharaoh's palace. But once again, there could be a logical explanation to a biblical plague. A sudden explosion of the frog population across the Nile Delta. And it's not down to the wrath of a vengeful god. Biologists at the Leibniz Institute have been studying the growth of frogs. Governed by hormones, the process usually takes 8 to 10 weeks. But the German experts have found that environmental stresses can speed the process up. When tadpoles are fed extra hormones, growth rate increases. Environmental stress works in the same way, naturally producing extra growth hormones in tadpoles that become frogs in half the normal time.
When tadpoles come under stress, especially due to drought, but also when there's a lack of oxygen, then this environmental stress accelerates their transformation into frogs. Their thyroid gland releases extra hormones, and the result can be a sudden massive appearance of frogs.
In the Bible story of Egypt's terrible plagues, an invasion of frogs followed a terrifying first plague, when the Nile River apparently turned into blood. This first plague can be explained by naturally occurring algae that depleted oxygen levels in the Nile. The river turned red, and oxygen-starved fish died out. But it turns out that low oxygen levels can also cause frog growth to accelerate, as the Bible story describes. A mass of frogs would leave the water and die. The mass frog spawn and die-off could have kick-started a chain reaction, with an entire generation of bug-eating frogs dying out. Insects could multiply unchecked. Insects, including lice, the third biblical plague that preceded Moses' legendary exodus out of Egypt.
The Lord said, "Stretch out thy rod, and smite the dust of the land, that it may become lice throughout all the land of Egypt." Exodus chapter 8, verses 16 and 17.
The biblical waves of lice are followed by yet another insect-borne pestilence, the fourth plague of flies.
This is what the Lord says, "Let my people go so that they may worship me. If you do not let my people go, I will send swarms of flies on you and your officials, on your people, and into your houses." Exodus chapter 8, verses 20 and 21.
You can imagine a chain reaction like this. A massive increase in the number of frogs would be followed by massive frog deaths. So they would no longer be there to eat the insects. Without fish and frogs, the insects would multiply exponentially. We know that insects often carry diseases like malaria, so the next step in the chain reaction is the outbreak of epidemics, causing the human population to fall ill.
According to the Bible, the four plagues still didn't convince the Pharaoh to free Moses and the Hebrew slaves. So God had a fifth plague up his sleeve, a devastating wave of disease to be unleashed upon the animals of Egypt. Once again, a seemingly supernatural event can be explained biologically. Disease would logically follow swarms of insects biting livestock.
Let my people go so that they may worship me. If you refuse, the hand of the Lord will bring a terrible plague on your livestock in the field, on your horses and donkeys and camels, and on your cattle and sheep and goats. Exodus chapter 9, verses 1 through 3.
An unrelenting Pharaoh is hit with a sixth plague, another wave of disease moving from animals to people. Experiments and observations have shown that the first six plagues could have been biologically linked. Research by Heidelberg's environmental scientists could explain how one plague triggered another. Opening a new door on the ancient biblical mystery, They suspect that climate change may explain the downfall of pyramesy and the biblical plagues. Their research began with a stalagmite taken from an ancient Egyptian cave. Its layers formed a record of weather patterns over millennia.
Stalagmites show that our ancestors were confronted with climate change again and again. In fact, they can provide a very precise record of variations in temperature and of wet and dry periods in the ancient past.
Periods of extreme rain or drought are recorded in the layers of a stalagmite. As it grows, the calcite absorbs traces of radioactive elements. Scientists use the concentration of these radioactive isotopes to calculate the overall age of a stalagmite. But individual isotopes can also be used to date individual layers. Separated in acid, concentrations of individual isotopes can be dated using a mass spectrometer. The information is used to make a graph of how the climate changed in ancient times. Periods of extreme drought and rain can be identified over thousands of years. These ebbs and flows can then explain radical changes in ancient societies. Heidelberg Academy scientist Augusto Maggini suspects that the ancient Nile Delta was subject to dramatic climate change. But this climate change explanation for the first 6 biblical plagues remains controversial. For many believers, historical and scientific details are less important. For them, the plagues are not a story or a parable, but a real account of divine power saving a chosen people. But experiments and ancient evidence suggest there may be real explanations for each of the first 6 plagues. Many scholars and scientists, intrigued by the biblical plagues, continue to search for clues at ancient sites and in laboratories. It's a story more than 1,000 years old that still compels both the faithful and non-believers to search for answers. An intriguing search for clues to the last devastating biblical plagues begins not in the deserts of Egypt, but in the Mediterranean Sea, north of Crete, on the island group of Santorini, and the remains of the ancient volcano, Thera, the epicenter of the greatest natural disaster to shake the ancient world, a massive eruption that reached far and wide, and maybe even into the pages of the book of Exodus.
It must have hit the peoples around the Mediterranean extremely hard. An island and a people well known in the region suddenly and completely disappeared. Nothing was left on Santorini.
After months of warning signs, the island finally burst apart in a series of gigantic explosions. The eruption at Santorini may explain the next 3 biblical plagues. Chapter 9 of the book of Exodus vividly describes the 7th plague.
This is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says. Let my people go, so that they may worship me. And Moses stretched forth his rod toward heaven, and the Lord sent thunder and hail, and the fire ran along upon the ground. Exodus chapter 9, verse 13 and 23.
The unnamed Pharaoh of Exodus is rendered powerless in the face of divine plagues. Thousands of giant hailstones crashed down on Egypt. Could the Santorini eruption possibly explain the biblical phenomenon? Atmospheric scientist Nadine von Braun is probing an ancient mystery that may have a logical explanation. Hail needs solid particles in the air, like dust, in order to grow. By adjusting the wind speed and temperature in an atmospheric chamber, she can mimic the conditions of a storm at an altitude of 2,000 meters. Injecting a particle of silver iodide into the chamber results in a hailstone. The longer it dances in the wind currents, the bigger it gets. Hailstorms occur when thunderstorm clouds collide with airborne particles. Supercooled water in the cloud attaches and freezes to particles, like sand or ash. 3,500 years ago, Thera's eruption released billions of tons of ash into the atmosphere. If even a fraction of those particles each formed a hailstone, the result would be an epic, even biblical hailstorm. According to the Bible, hail from the seventh plague destroys the Egyptian harvest. Humans and livestock flee in terror. The story of the seventh plague could be a folktale passed down through generations of the traumatic fallout from Thera's massive eruption. But what of the next terrifying biblical plagues? Locusts and celestial darkness. It turns out these apparently divine disasters could also relate to extreme atmospheric conditions.
With the first 9 signs and wonders, you have a 3 and 3 and 3 pattern. You've got 3 plagues that are related to water. Then you've got 3 that are affecting animals, even if they affect people too. And then 3 that are airborne menaces that Moses brings about.
The fabled 7th, 8th, and 9th plagues of Egypt are all related to weather anomalies. Does the ancient eruption at Santorini offer a tantalizing explanation of real events? The devastating ancient eruption at Santorini may be a logical explanation to the supernatural plagues of ancient Egypt described in the Old Testament. According to the Bible, a 7th plague sent to punish the Pharaoh, a massive crop-destroying hailstorm, failed to persuade him to free his Hebrew slaves. So, an 8th plague is unleashed upon Egypt.
And Moses stretched forth his rod over the land of Egypt, and the Lord brought an east wind upon the land all that day and all that night. And when it was morning, the east wind brought the locusts. Exodus chapter 10, verse 13.
The biblical locusts devoured what little survived the hailstorm. Crops and trees were stripped bare.
Many consider the locusts to be the plagues par excellence. And yes, we can explain it in the light of the ash fallout. Because the ash fallout had caused weather anomalies, which translates into higher precipitations, higher humidity. And that's exactly what fosters the presence of the locusts.
As locusts move on air currents, the 8th plague, together with the hailstorm, may be part of a large ecological chain reaction caused by the eruption at Santorini. If volcanic ash created a massive hailstorm, the low-pressure system that accompanied the storm may have also carried huge swarms of locusts. And as ash accumulated, the sky could have darkened. The next plague that appears in the Bible story describes this very scenario.
The Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand toward the sky so that the darkness will spread over Egypt, darkness that can be felt." So Moses stretched out his hand toward the sky, and total darkness covered all Egypt for 3 days. No one could see anyone else or leave his place for 3 days. Exodus chapter 10, verses 21 through 23.
A total eclipse of the sun is another possible explanation for the 9th plague. But a solar eclipse lasts for only a few minutes, while the Bible describes a darkness that settles for 3 days. Desert sandstorms are another possible explanation. They can lead to long periods of darkness over wide areas. But volcanoes are another common cause of blackouts. Volcanic ash, high in the atmosphere, can block out sunlight. The ash fallout of the Santorini eruption may have caused the biblical plague of darkness. Evidence linking the Santorini disaster to the 3 weather-related plagues of the Bible is compelling, has a logical explanation to the fantastic Bible story being found. Unusual stones found amid ancient Egyptian ruins. Kept in an underground storeroom, they appear to be pumice, porous stones made of cooled lava. But there are no volcanoes in Egypt. They could be physical evidence that the ash fallout from the eruption of Santorini did reach Egyptian shores. After the Santorini volcano collapsed, a mass of displaced water built up into huge, destructive tsunamis. These massive walls of water raced over many hundreds of kilometers and could well have carried and deposited pumice stones and debris onto the Nile Delta. Researchers were one step closer toward establishing a link between the Santorini eruption and the later weather-related plagues of the Bible. But 2 critical questions remained unanswered. Exactly when did the eruption occur? And did it coincide with the biblical Exodus? Scientific argument has raged for decades over the exact date of the Santorini eruption. Some experts say it was as early as 1620 BC. Others have dated it as late as 1550 or 1500 BC.
We measured 2 separate samples of the second olive branch, as we did with the first, and these measurements confirm that the volcanic eruption took place in the 17th century BC and not the 16th century.
The problem with linking Santorini and the Exodus is that they are at least 100 years apart, if not more. The eruption of Santorini has been redated now and took place probably in about 1628 BC. And 1628 means that the Exodus and the eruption are separated by about 200 years, according to the Bible. Even if you put the Exodus down in about 1250 BC, which is what most archaeologists would, then the eruption of Santorini and the Exodus are separated by more than 4 centuries. That's an awful long time, and sure, you can do whatever you want. However, a historian is not going to buy it. An archaeologist is not going to buy it. And even most people out there are going to say, you know, that's stretching it just a little bit too much.
Even so, Others are confident there's a connection between the massive volcanic eruption at Santorini and the later biblical plagues of Egypt. Their search for evidence is just one of many investigations attempting to link the first 9 biblical plagues with plausible scientific explanations. The first 9 biblical plagues could be explained by natural phenomena, the result of extreme weather or disasters like volcanic eruptions. But the story of the final plague, the death of the firstborns, is more difficult to explain or attribute to any historical fact.
The Bible treats the first 9 as separate from the 10th. Very few people have died in the previous plagues. The hail has killed a few people. None of the others are there any deaths of humans recorded. The 10th plague has somewhat of a life of its own because of the Passover, and it's certainly remembered in the rest of the Bible in the way that the other 9 are not.
The 10th plague of Exodus was the one that the Bible story says finally convinced the Pharaoh to set the Hebrew captives free. But to believe such an event actually took place requires faith. There's no proof. Only the Old Testament account of the 10th plague that's more detailed than any of the other 9. In the Bible story, God gave Moses a specific account of what was in store for the Egyptian king if he refused to comply. It says Moses went before the Pharaoh to deliver God's final warning. According to the Bible, that night the Hebrews follow divine instructions, marking their doors with the blood of a sacrificed lamb. It's a symbol that will spare them a visit from the angel of death, due to pass through Egypt later that night. Behind bolted doors, the Hebrews also have to prepare a Passover meal, according to instructions from above. According to the Bible story, the angel of death passes over Hebrew houses marked with lamb's blood, only to strike without mercy on Egyptian homes, killing firstborn children and animals. Including the Pharaoh's eldest son. Various scenarios have been suggested as explanations for the 10th plague of Exodus, including illness or infectious disease. Ancient Egyptians kept surplus food stores to feed the population when harvests were poor. Perhaps grain supplies were contaminated after the first 9 plagues, affected by the extreme humidity surrounding hailstorms, or poisoned by insect excretions from the flies or locusts. A lethal fungal mold may have taken hold. Trichotillin is a poison formed by a fungus called Fusarium. It can kill both humans and animals. Supporters of this theory argue that male firstborns would have had first pickings of precious reserves, so they would have been the first to fall victim. But Psalm 78 of the Old Testament offers another explanation for the 10th plague: disease. Plagues of infectious diseases have ravaged populations throughout history. The Bible specifically says that only the Egyptian firstborns died. But we now know that viruses and bacteria don't differentiate in that way. Like the Passover meal and the lamb's blood, this detail is more likely down to religious symbolism than historical fact.
The last plague is very different from the others. It isn't linked to natural phenomena. You could say it's a theological plague. It seems very cruel to us because Yahweh will massacre all the firstborn of Egypt. What does that mean? It means the total extermination of Egypt. Because in the ancient Middle East, the firstborn symbolized the future of a people. Losing the firstborns is losing the future.
In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was more than just a ruler. He was a god, a divine presence on earth. The story of the 10th plague symbolizes the superiority of the Hebrew god over the divinity of the pharaoh. Egypt's future, the firstborn, was symbolically killed off while the birth of Israel was just beginning. The 10th plague finally allowed Moses to lead more than 600,000 Hebrew slaves out of Egypt to the promised land of Israel. But it's still just a story. Archaeologists have found no trace of a mass human migration in the area. For believers, faith in the Bible and its epic stories is enough, but there is no proof. Yet tantalizing questions continue to captivate researchers. Who were the Hebrew slaves apparently spared from a 10th plague? Did the biblical exodus out of Egypt ever really happen? For centuries, scholars have tried to find evidence pointing to the biblical accounts. Poring over the ancient scriptures, searching for clues as to where and when the exodus might have occurred.
The Exodus story, it's a plausible story. It certainly could have happened. The question is when, who's involved, how many are involved, the details of it. But is it a plausible story? Yes. Did it actually happen? Maybe. Do we have proof for it yet? Not yet.
Throughout history, natural disasters and foreign invasions have had a profound cultural impact on societies across the globe. These impacts have been recorded in ancient texts, carvings, and stories. Those who wrote the Old Testament may have simply been recording folk memories passed down through generations.
The plagues certainly did not happen within the space of a few days, as they are described in the Bible. But every one of the first 9 plagues can be traced back to natural phenomena that existed in Egypt, and to an extent still exist there today.
Now, I'm reluctant to come up with natural causes for all of the plagues. The problem with the naturalistic explanations is that they lose the whole point, and the whole point was that you didn't come out of Egypt by natural causes. You came out by the hand of God.
Faith in the hand of God remains key to belief in the Bible stories. There's still no proof. Besides the Old Testament, there is nothing to say that the exodus from Egypt did or did not occur.
We're limited by what we've already found in archaeology and how far we can push the text. Is it history? Is it just a story? The one thing, though, about all of this is it could all change tomorrow. All it takes is one more inscription being unearthed at an excavation. We've just got no evidence per se. And yet, could it have happened? Of course. Do we have proof? Not yet. Will we find it at some point? We might. So the jury is still out.
Like all religion, the epic Bible story of the 10 plagues and the great exodus to Israel remains a matter of faith, as timeless and profound as the ancient land of Egypt itself.